Hey everyone, this is Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're benchmarking Kingston's V300 against itself. There's been a bit of a stir in the tech community lately after reports a few months ago that users were seeing significantly lower benchmark scores with their SSD now V300s than the ones reviewed by the press. And some of the initial models, of course. It was largely understood that the performance difference is a result of Kingston silently switching to Micron's 20 nanometer asynchronous NAND from their original model's 19 nanometer toggle mode synchronous NAND from Toshiba, the important part being the synchronous bit versus asynchronous. So just to be clear, the current model is asynchronous, and the model that is no longer shipping that was originally tested was using synchronous NAND. I wasn't satisfied with the user tests out there since they primarily rely on incompressible benchmarks like SSD, and so I built a trace-based real-world test to accompany a suite of synthetic benchmarks to test the claims that the performance dropped. Full disclaimer, this video is going to be a bit shorter than normally because I have a flight in a couple of hours for GDC and GTC, so my apologies. Hit the link in the description below for the full article that goes in full detail on what all this synchronous versus asynchronous stuff means. The objective of this experiment was to investigate the performance differences between asynchronous and synchronous NAND as it pertains to Kingston's V300 SSD. The switch happened entirely for cost and supply reasons, and is the sole reason that the V300 is currently available for about $70 to $80 these days for a 120 gigabyte model. Anyway, let's briefly talk about the two types of NAND used. The difference between synchronous and asynchronous NAND largely stems from the way the timing circuit prompts data transmission. In this graphic by Samsung, we can see that the timing circuit used for this particular asynchronous NAND design is prompting a read event, that's RE, signal on the fall of each signal wave. The synchronous NAND, however, sends its signal on the rise and fall of each signal wave, so about 2 times as often, and produces almost a 2x difference on paper. So with SSDs, on paper is very rarely translated to real world because the way controllers work and operating systems work and all the overhead in between, but that's what we're testing. This is sort of like the difference between an asynchronous stopwatch that you can stop with a button and a synchronous or continuous wall clock. In theory, asynchronous NAND should see the biggest drawbacks in sequential and incompressible actions. You can read about the methodology below, but we're just going to dive straight into benchmarks because I'm on borrowed time for that GDC flight. So the devices were preconditioned for each type of test before testing initiated, first of all. Starting with my in-house test suite, we can see that the Windows 7 boot time differences were totally unnoticeable and within margin of error. You can ignore them. The WinRAR extraction and compression differences were pretty noticeable, 15% in the case of compression, and that's going to be the very few users will do a lot of compression or extraction on a daily basis. If you do, you know who you are, great. For the handbrake transcoding process, we saw absolutely zero difference, primarily because this test is more bound by the CPU and RAM than storage. For this test, I used largely incompressible data that was 10.3 gigabytes in total size. The data consisted of several hundred songs and a couple of large video files, all in MP3, MP4, and AVI formats. Because this data is already heavily compressed by the nature of the formats, the SSD considers it to be largely incompressible data and will thus perform slower by the nature of the SandForce controller. We see a massive 51.7% difference between the old V300 that's no longer available and the current V300. So that's pretty big. You're going to notice that if you're moving a lot of files around. But as for how many users move enough files to notice on a regular basis, we'll talk about that in a moment. For Premiere encoding, there's about a 6% delta, which is sizable for anyone spending 20 hours a day rendering, but outside of that, it's really not noticeable. And moving on to a 46% incompressible benchmark, or rather 46% compressed data benchmark using Anvil's storage utilities, we see that asynchronous the asynchronous V300 that I'm calling the V300A suffers hard in sequential operations and operations of a high queue depth, but seems to do fine in low queue depth operations. So that's sort of expected. Now, as a user, you're going to be mostly using 4K random operations and even 1K random operations almost entirely at a queue depth of 1 or 2 for most actions, and you'll occasionally peak at 4 depending on what you're doing. Most games that I've done trace testing in are 1K queue depth 1, so that's kind of what you're interested in if you're gaming, but keep in mind the performance is already so high on both of these drives for things like gaming. You're really not going to notice a difference in your load time or anything like that. It'll be fractions of a second for most games, so do keep that in mind. Finally, we have some iometer tests. I have these full tests on the website, of course, and it's really just showing more of the same. For Anvil, it's showing our 1K queue depth 1 bench that I talked about, and again, we see huge differences with the higher queue depths, but for the lower stuff, queue depth 1, queue depth 4, it's somewhat unnoticeable for the average user. So the conclusion here, or the question rather for the conclusion, is the new V300 actually worth buying with all of these changes? Is the asynchronous NAND so detrimental that you should no longer be buying it? The short answer, as always, is it depends. If you are a power user, if you're doing compression and file transfers and rendering and stuff that I do for the website, like all these videos, you should absolutely care, because that 50% difference in a file transfer for large media files, when you're dealing with 100 gigabytes of media files, that's a big deal. And the same goes for our rendering. A 6% delta for one video a day is not going to be noticeable. When you're rendering 20 hours a day, that can be huge. That can be an extra video you can put out that day. So that's sort of where you want to go towards Kingston's own HyperX, actually, which is within spitting distance of the V300. It's $5 or $10 more, and it uses synchronous NAND, and it's a bit faster, and by a bit I mean a lot faster. So that's sort of where I would push most power users and users who can identify with my own usage patterns, because for $10 you get something that will make you a bit happier when you're producing content. For the average user who's trying to find an SSD to stick in their laptop to boot a little faster and to load applications a little faster, you're probably going to be fine with the V300. The other option right now, I guess, is the M500. Is about the same price. I haven't tested that one, so I can't recommend it. But at the $70 or $80 price point of a 120 gigabyte V300, it's perfectly fine for everyday actions. You're not going to notice those differences all that much, and for the most part, you're going to be doing compressible file transactions, because that's what your OS does. That's what all your log files do. That's what your browser does when it's caching data. That's what a lot of saves and other document-based applications will do. Gaming does deal with a lot of incompressible stuff, and media is a lot of incompressible stuff, but you're still sitting in the 46% compressible data range. So my conclusion, I guess, then, is that if you are a mainstream user who's sticking this in a laptop or a desktop that's doing office applications, you shouldn't get too hung up on this. If you are a power user, you should probably care and do more research. If you're just gaming, we'll say, quote, just a gamer, and you're not doing a lot of content creation, then once again, not a huge impact. You shouldn't get too hung up on this. But for $10 more, I would push you all day long toward the HyperX, except if you're on an ultra budget. If you're building one of our cheap bastard systems, you might as well just save the $10, I guess, and get the V300 if that so pleases you, if you can't fit a $10 more drive in your budget, which is totally reasonable. So that's where I stand on it. Please check the article for full details, and I will see you all next time. Peace.